Well, there you are. We needed to have that. So, welcome all. Um, the purpose of our meeting today is a workshop, one of the workshops on the plan, and we'll proceed on that in just a couple of minutes. I just wanted to, we need to follow a typical agenda. So I want to know if there are any announcements that need to be made that are not related to this meeting. Okay, I hear none, so we'll proceed. Um, we also have an item that we are required to call upon to see if anyone wishes to make a comment to this board for an item that is not on the agenda. We will listen, but we are not allowed to respond or discuss. So does anyone want to present a comment unrelated to today's workshop? Okay, I see none and I hear none. So welcome everyone. I'm assuming that people who are online understand to be muted until they wish to talk. Um, I will very soon turn this management meeting over to Ruth Darling of the Flood Board staff to introduce the item and that, but just want to say a couple things about being muted. There will be presentations, there is a PowerPoint, and at various points we will pause to ask for comments. I will first ask the board members, want an input, questions, or comments. And then I will go to the participants. If you'll raise your hand, I'll know to call upon you. If you choose to use the chat for any reason, please know that that's not considered giving input today. But if we see something, if I see something that I want to call out, then I'll just use that prerogative to do that. But we will keep track of those that are in chat because they're always interesting, but they don't constitute actual. Please do this. And please know, as I follow this to see how long it goes, I may call a break, but not for like, maybe an hour and a half, but I'm not one that just keeps going. We planned for 2 hours today, so there'll probably be one break. So those are, any questions from board members or anyone else before I start the workshop with Ms. Darling? I see nothing. So good morning to you all. It's not 115 in Chico, so we're all happy. So let me call on Ruth Darling, the board staff, who will, from this point on, manage the meeting. So good morning, Ruth.
Good morning, President Dolan. My name is Ruth Darling. I'm a program manager with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and today we are addressing comments that on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan related to funding and policy recommendations. So I will introduce the presentation, starting off with the schedule for the workshops, as well as describing pathways for how comments will be addressed in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, as well as through the board process of adoption. And then I will turn it over to my colleagues at Department of Water Resources, who will take a deeper dive into funding and policy recommendation comments and how they're being addressed. And then we will have a brief introduction on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan's call to action. And then we would like to open it up, as President Dolan mentioned, being able to stop and ask questions is open. However, we can have a board discussion as well as a public discussion following the presentation. So with that, I'd like to ask Chavez to start sharing the PowerPoint.
Just one more example of how we love online meetings and technology. Are you working on that, Chavez?
Yes, sorry, just a moment.
Okay. We know it's a challenge. This is the quietest meeting I've attended. Yay! There it is. Thank you, Ms. Darling.
Thank you. So again, this is our virtual workshop. It's our second workshop for comments on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. Next slide, please. And I would just like to provide a brief overview on the schedule. So next slide, please, Chavez. So we did have our first workshop on July 15th. That was on comments received on the conservation strategy, as well as the topic of operation and maintenance. Today's August 5th for funding and policy recommendations and a brief overview of the plan's call to action. A week from today, on August 12th, we will address comments related to climate change. And then we are shooting for an October 28th adoption of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan at the board's regular business board meeting. Next slide, please. And so I would just like to discuss the recommended pathways for the comments through the adoption process. Next slide. So we've seen this slide before at board meetings as well as workshops. And this is how comments are received. They can lead to revisions in the draft 2022 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, or they can be addressed in the board resolution for adoption. Some comments will be addressed in the 27 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update or future updates, or be addressed through other state processes. And all of those will lead to the flood board's resolution of adoption, hopefully in October. Next slide, please. So revisions to the draft of the flood plan may include modifications based on public comment and board direction. It could include editorial changes and edits for consistency, as well as clarifications. And it's the job of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board to consider the extent and importance of suggested revisions to the flood plan. And with that, I'll pause before I turn it over to our colleagues at DWR. Are there any questions? I see no hands raised. So Mary Jimenez.
Hi, Tina. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mary Jimenez from DWR. Can I get a thumbs up if my sound is working? Thank you very much. Pleased to be here this morning with my colleagues from DWR. Thank you very much, Ruth. So our focus, as Ruth mentioned, for today is on funding comments and policy recommendations. So to help with this presentation, we have Hillary Mann and Jason Sidley, also from DWR, to provide the more focused content for the board. I wanted to mention that we recognize the highly interrelated nature of many of these comments to one another, as well as to some of the other topics covered at the other board workshops as part of the adoption process relating to the conservation strategy and climate change. And so to that end, well, we do have other folks from the department on the line today to listen and to receive the board's direction. So we have David Martasian and others logged on as well for assistance. And so with that, I'd like to hand off to Hillary Mann to take over on funding if she's ready. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary. Is my sound coming through? Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Hillary Mann. I'm a senior water resources engineer with the Division of Flood Management, and I'm currently leading the investment strategy update for the 2022 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. In this portion of today's presentation, I will provide an overview of comments received related to funding and our recommendations on how to address those comments. Next slide, please. The funding-related comments received have been categorized into 4 themes, including investment need and balance of portfolio, funding mechanisms, equity in funding, and capital improvements and maintenance areas. On the next set of slides, I'll discuss comments falling under each of these themes in more detail. Next slide. The first set of comments we will discuss today are related to the investment needs and balance of the SSIA portfolio described in Chapter 4 of the CVFPB. As a reminder, the CVFPB identified an investment need of $25 to $30 billion over the 30-year planning horizon. A comment received described concerns over obtaining the large investment need considering state and federal funding barriers, and identified a concern over the portion of the investment need that is skewed towards locals. When considering this comment, it's important to note that the total CVFPB investment increase was heavily influenced by the priorities recommended by the Regional Flood Management Planning Program. To achieve the flood risk reduction goals and societal values articulated in the CVFPB over the next 30 years, much larger contributions are required from all cost-sharing partners. It is recognized that many local communities cannot comply with the cost share requirements for some flood management projects because of the magnitude of costs involved in institutional capacity limitations. Because of this, DWR has attempted to integrate within its grant programs opportunities to reduce local cost shares. While no adjustments to the local cost share within the 2022 funding plan are recommended at this time, it is recognized that regional collaboration will be key to address challenges with funding barriers. An additional comment received noted that a higher capital investment need is shown in the Sacramento Basin compared to the San Joaquin Basin, despite the significant need identified in technical analysis work performed in support of the CVFPB. As mentioned previously, the current portfolio was influenced by actions submitted by the RFMPs. No changes to the portfolio are recommended for this 2022 update. However, we recognize that it is likely that projects in the Sacramento Basin have more detail at this time, and it's expected that the San Joaquin need will change in future updates to the plan as more projects are formulated and cost estimates are developed. The final comment noted here described concerns over the rising costs of OMRR&R that are the results of permitting issues and the rising costs of labor. The state recognizes this is a challenge and intends to work with stakeholders and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board to address this issue. Next slide, please. The next set of comments we will discuss today are related to funding mechanisms. There are three categories of comments identified on this slide. The first is related to local, state, and federal funding barriers. The next set of comments are related to lack of funding for existing funding mechanisms. And the last set of comments were related to new potential funding mechanisms. Examples of funding barriers discussed in comments included grant requirements to incorporate riparian habitat within proposed project footprints, the inability to use grant funds for required environmental permitting and mitigation, high cost shares for federal programs such as BRIC, and onerous application processes. Recommendations provided by stakeholders included convening focus groups to address these funding barriers. We acknowledge that there are significant challenges in obtaining funding and agree that regional collaboration will be key in committees and workshops to address funding barriers. The next set of comments requested the addition of language mentioning the challenge of lack of funding for programs such as the Small Community Flood Risk Reduction Program and the Flood System Repair Program. We recognize that this is an issue which impacts equity discussions and recommend adding language to identify this as a regional challenge. Finally, comments were received noting that alternative funding mechanisms such as community-based flood insurance may help support the funding plan and address residual flood risk management. While at this time it's not recommended to add new funding mechanisms to the recommended funding plan, we recognize that alternative funding mechanisms may help support the implementation of the plan where the proposed funding mechanisms fall short. We recommend adding language to the plan to consider a pilot community-based flood insurance program to provide an affordable alternative to increasing costs of the National Flood Insurance Program. A community-based flood insurance program is a mandatory program for all residents in a given area, and similarly to health insurance, premiums can be lower than National Flood Insurance Program alternatives due to the number of individuals in the program. In future updates to the plan, integration of new funding mechanisms into the funding plan will be considered. Next slide, please. The next set of comments we received are related to equity in funding for flood risk management, local cash flow challenges, and grant program retention and reimbursement policies. Several comments noted the need to address equity in flood risk management. Others noted that the discrepancy of funding for rural and disadvantaged communities compared to urban areas needs to be addressed. The state is currently taking steps to increase awareness of this issue. We recommend adding text that includes the recommendation to support advancement of equity across the flood system through refinements to the SSIA and future updates to the CVFPB so that the most vulnerable communities are addressed in program level priorities. Another set of comments discussed the inability of rural, small, and disadvantaged communities to provide local cost shares and noted that onerous grant application processes may require local cash flow that disadvantaged communities cannot provide. We recommend adding language to better describe these funding challenges. The last comment included on this slide is regarding the need to address DWR grant program retention and reimbursement policies. While it is acknowledged that grant retention and reimbursement policies present challenges for local partners, current policies are required to follow state legal requirements, so no changes are recommended at this time. Next slide, please. The last set of comments related to funding content that we will discuss today pertains to capital improvements and maintenance areas. We received comments regarding concerns over financial constraints or a lack of funding in maintenance areas. Additionally, we received a comment requesting the state develop policies to support the development of capital improvement plans within state maintenance areas to advance the planning, design, and construction of capital improvement projects. While no changes to the plan to address this issue are being proposed at this time, we understand that this is a critical issue and support working with the board and stakeholders to further this discussion. Next slide, please. In addition to addressing public comments, the investment strategy team has been continuing to work with the DWR Flood Maintenance and Operations Branch to ensure that the plan accurately identifies the funding needs required to properly maintain the state plan of flood control. That work has resulted in some adjustments to the funding plan that we will discuss on the next slide. Next slide, please. On this slide, we are showing the investment need for annual operations and maintenance, as well as deferred maintenance and repair, rehabilitation, and replacement, also referred to as RR&R. The investment need shown here has been updated since the public draft as a result of continued coordination with the Department of Water Resources Flood Maintenance and Operations Branch to gain a better understanding of the state costs required to properly maintain the state plan of flood control system. In addition to the Flood Maintenance and Operations Branch input, the costs shown here were informed by input from the regional flood management planning groups on unit costs and management actions submitted early in the SSIA portfolio refinement process. The combined input from regional flood management planning groups and DWR has led to an improved characterization of OMRR&R projected future costs, which are shown on the two graphics on this slide. On the left, we have an updated annual operations and maintenance need of $98 million per year, which is an increase from the historical average annual expenditure of $48 million per year. On the right, we have the updated deferred maintenance and RR&R need of $164 million per year compared to the current average state expenditure of $23 million per year. Note that the average annual deferred maintenance and RR&R expenditures shown here only represents state spending from 2011 to 2021. It does not capture local deferred maintenance expenditures or the recent influx of deferred maintenance funds, which have been designated but yet to be expended. Additionally, within the larger portfolio, the deferred maintenance and RR&R future costs are included as a capital need. However, they are shown here as an annual need for comparison purposes. The capital need for deferred maintenance over the 30-year planning horizon is approximately $3.2 billion. This update to the OMRR&R future costs does not result in any changes to the overall investment need of $25 to $30 billion and does not result in a change to the recommended local cost share. However, it does better characterize the investment need required to properly implement annual O&M and address deferred maintenance and RR&R. Therefore, we recommend updating the CVFPB with the updates shown here. Next slide. Thank you. And that wraps up our comments and recommended revisions for funding. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Member Countryman?
If you could go back a slide to that you were showing, please.
Nope, that's going forward,
One more, the one with the graphs.
backwards.
Anyway, this one. What's the definition of deferred maintenance versus the annual O&M?
Good question.
So we have specific actions that we've categorized. The annual O&M actions are typically what we would expect LMAs to perform on an annual basis. So that might be vegetation removal and other activities such as that. And then RR&R activities or deferred maintenance activities are essentially any activity that can't be performed on an ongoing annual basis. So that could be an erosion repair. It could be larger channel sediment removal as well that can't be performed on an annual basis would be considered RR&R. It could also be some pipe replacement actions as well.
Okay, so it's a routine annual versus something that's non-routine that needs to be done. That's right.
That's right. Or in the case of deferred maintenance, it could be something that should be routine, but we're not able to get to it on a routine basis and it's become deferred.
That's what I was wondering. How much is deferred of what's normally done versus some special item? So what you're saying that special items plus annual maintenance that hasn't been done and should have been done?
Yeah.
Sometimes there's not funding for annual maintenance. That's one of the constraints. The board in 2017 with that plan had lots of discussions and stakeholder meetings and workshops and developed a resolution called the OMRR&R resolution we should be trying to define. So that's kind of on the list of things to review to see if it needs updating.
Okay.
It
All right.
could just be O&M. Then we got OM and R. Now we have OMRR and R. And it's, yeah, if you don't do something, it becomes deferred maintenance.
Okay, thank you.
But there definitely are funding constraints on an annual basis. I think that's what these charts indicate. We're behind the curve in what we need.
Through the chair.
Member Grego?
So in 2017 plan, was the O&M and the deferred maintenance as sad as it is today in this graph?
No, in the 2017 plan, annual O&M and deferred maintenance were not separated from each other. In the 2017 plan, we had OM, RR, and R categorized together as an ongoing investment need. For this 2022 update, we've separated out annual O&M as an ongoing need and then deferred maintenance and RR and R as a capital need to better reflect how our funding requests are put forth so that we can have a better understanding of what the needs are for those two different categories.
Yeah, it's quite a gap. I'm glad that you separated them. Tells a story. Thank you.
President Dolan.
Member Johnson?
Thank you. I just want to echo that comment, and I'm curious whether, understanding that they weren't separated out last time, if staff here could characterize how this is changing through time. From when we first adopted the plan and, through the most recent updates to now, are the investments that we've called for and that everybody is working, in this audience is, working hard to carry out, taking a bite out of this, or is it getting worse over time? And we're falling farther behind on deferred maintenance and annual needs. And if those stats aren't available, maybe just a general characterization from people who know, and we could talk about whether and how to daylight that information as part of the plan and the call to action.
Yeah, I can respond. I'll start with the respond of some general characterizations of trends we've seen and then allow others to provide input. In general, since 2017, when we characterized this large gap in spending versus annual O&M R&R need, we did see an increase in funding that was allocated through a general fund increase and through the creation of our FMAP program. And through that, we can see a significant trend in an increase in spending on annual O&M. So the gap in what is needed for annual O&M and what is being spent is being improved in that regard. However, we are not still meeting what the actual annual O&M need is. Therefore, there is still this deferred maintenance, which is occurring. In addition to that, we received a large influx of deferred maintenance funding. However, also following the 2017 plan, there was a significant storms that resulted in storm damage. And so money that was originally intended to be for existing deferred maintenance at the time was then used to respond to those 2017 storms. And so while we've achieved significant additional funding, we've also seen changes in the system that funding has had to be allocated towards. I think also moving forward with this update, one change since 2017 is that we have a much better understanding of what the current spending is for the state. We have done work with our fiscal database and are better to more accurately capture spending, and through that can see how we might need to better characterize what our future need is. But there still is a gap there, and we still are accruing deferred maintenance.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and I think this is an important part of the the analysis and also the the case that we make, right? How is the state and people here actions helping and what's working and what have we over time, and what does that portend for the future as we roll this out and make the case for the further investment.
Right. Any other board members?
Yeah, through the chair, I have one last question. On this annual O&M and deferred maintenance, this has to have an impact on the 8499, programs. Is that correct?
The federal repair program of PL 8499?
Yeah, yes, the PL 8499.
Mm-mm.
It does. In the general fund increase that I mentioned before that's going towards FMAP does help support our LMAs in creating SWIFTs, which are creating LOIs and SWIFTs, which are allowing them to get back into that PL 8499 program.
Okay, thank you.
Good. I don't see a hand or mic on for board members, so I do see that Mr. Reinhardt has his hand up. Rick Reinhardt?
Thank you, President Dolan. Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers on behalf of the Flood Control Association. Two comments. First, I believe Hillary stated that there wasn't an intent to address some of the comments that have been made with respect to challenges disadvantaged communities have because of statutory restrictions. And the two things that I can think of that fall into that category are providing advanced funding for construction for disadvantaged communities and reducing retention. And if it's accurate that DWR lacks the statutory authority what I think a better outcome would be to propose pursuing statutory authority that allowed DWR to do that. If we need a change in law, let's pursue the change in law and not continue to have these as impediments to implementation of projects, especially in disadvantaged communities. Building on that, another comment that I wasn't thinking about when we submitted our original comments, and this falls as much under the board's purview, is while DWR has made great strides in their grant funding of disadvantaged communities, increasing the state cost share to reduce impediments to implementation, they haven't done that, or that hasn't been done for Army Corps of Engineers projects. We've seen some movement on that with the legislature this past year approving 100% state cost share for the Pajaro project. But that's an area right now where, or program right now, where the state's cost share is capped at 70%, regardless of whether you're a disadvantaged community or not. I think that should be highlighted and legislation pursued if necessary, so that board-sponsored DWR supported program can be cost shared just like any other disadvantaged community. That's all I have. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for that. I know through all the meetings of developing this plan and for the last 4 years, the barriers to funding, particularly at local levels, have been brought up many times, and grant restraints. Okay. I don't see any other hands. So let me see. Any participants? Oh, Board Member Johnson?
No, thank you, President Dolan. I don't think I have further questions about the presentation right now, but I'm likely to have further comments about the investment strategy, and I'll flag that now. But I feel like it's probably more productive to see the rest of the presentation and talk about it all together and come back to that as we're later in the presentation.
Okay, there'll be time for that. Just to let you all know, I saw a preview and there was more than 20 slides, so there will be much more information that might be helpful. Is it back to you, Ms. Mann, or someone else?
It's over to Jason Sidley.
Mr. Sidley.
Well, good morning. Morning, President Dolan, members of the board. As Hillary mentioned, my name is Jason Sidley with the Division of Multi-Benefit Initiatives. And today I am going to talk to the group about some of the comments we received on our policy recommendations. The next slide, please. So the 8 policy issue categories defined in the 2017 CVFPB update as impediments to implementation are shown on the left side of the plus sign. You're probably familiar with these icons from the 2017 update. We added 2 policy issue categories for 2022, one surrounding equity and issues in flood management and the effects of climate change on our flood management systems. The policy recommendations in the 2017 update were organized into the 8 policy issue categories, and we had 70 some odd recommendations or so in that document. For the 2022 update, we created a set of high priority recommendations that are highlighted in table 3-3 of the document, and those generally cut across multiple policy issue categories. They're not focused on one category, but mainly policy issue recommendations that help address several of these the previous policy issue categories at one time. And they address the largest impediments to CVFPB implementation based on the engagement and review conducted as part of the 2022 update process. Our discussion today will focus on comments on policy issue recommendations, other than those that have been covered in other workshops. For instance, Hillary handled the major comments regarding funding policy recommendations in her presentation just a few minutes ago. And more discussion around climate change related policy issues and recommendations is expected at next week's workshop on August 12th. Next slide, please. So similar to the way we've laid out some of the other presentations, these policy recommendation comments were broken into various themes. The themes for the discussion today include level of detail and policy recommendation implementation, urban recommendations priorities, encroachments and wise use of floodplains, and levee repairs and improvements. Next slide, please. And I will admit I cannot see the chat or any hands raised at this time. So if board president Dolan, excuse me, or others want to flag me if there's a need to pause, I can handle that. So the first theme is the level of detail and policy issue recommendation implementation. So in general, we have a lot of positive comments and support for the draft recommendations. A lot of folks see benefits to these recommendations and are on board with helping to get these things rolling. We also did receive some comments about the need for additional implementation detail. Recommendations are admittedly high level. Some of the recommendations do have more detail than others. Some are further along in development, like some of our funding recommendations based on our investment strategy work, while some are more conceptual. There is more supporting details for these higher level recommendations in Appendix C of the document. So you can go in there and take a peek at some of those. Regarding implementation of these recommendations, one thought that we had was shortly after adoption, DWR could start looking at ways to work with our state, federal, and local partners to develop implementation plans for these recommendations that are highlighted in Table 3-3. One of the intended outcomes for these implementation plans will be to facilitate our partners and our DWR programs to be able to seek funding to work on these efforts. We're looking at ways to potentially refine some of the language around Table 3-3 to highlight the need to develop these implementation plans. We did receive comments on the funding needs that don't support the recommendations. And as mentioned before, the recommendations were generally well regarded. We did receive comments on how the current state funding priorities do not seem to match some of the recommendations. One specific comment that came through is that the small communities programs, especially with the push towards equity in this update, and how, as Hillary just mentioned a little bit ago, we've got recommendations in there that push for funding for small communities. And this did not seem to match up with how the current state budget has little to no funding for small communities flood management included this fiscal year. These comments definitely highlight the need to continue strengthening the role of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and guiding state funding through our various engagements, and how we message the update and how our interested parties can use the document to help them advocate for funding. We're not recommending any major changes to the documents to address this comment, but wanted to raise it to the attention. Next slide, please. We also received comments stating that there was not enough detail in what is planned to be completed by 2027, specifically for urban areas. Also in these comments was a desire to see a clear status in the update for achieving 200-year level of protection for urban areas. Large-scale system-wide and urban management actions that are in progress or expected to be completed over the next several years are covered at a programmatic level in Chapter 3. We did receive several comments providing us more specific progress updates on some of these, and we'll recommend making adjustments in the document where appropriate to reflect these updates in Chapter 3. Regarding the state's role in providing 200-year level of protection in the urban areas, while the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan highlights the collective goal of achieving 200-year level of protection in the Central Valley urban areas, it's local agencies, not the state, that are responsible for achieving that 200-year level of protection in their areas by 2025 to meet Senate Bill 5 requirements. The state does have a role in helping provide leadership and cost sharing to facilitate flood risk reduction projects, but it is local agencies' responsibility to identify and implement the improvements that will achieve the 200-year level of protection and ultimately certify the level of protection. We will look through the document to verify if there are any potential refinements that can be made to help clarify this topic if it's ambiguous. One item of note is that one of the supporting documents for the update, the Flood System Status Report, also includes more detailed status updates on some of the major U.S. Army Corps of Engineers projects that are implementing improvements in urban areas as well. So it might be a good resource for folks. Next slide, please. We received a set of similar comments from several folks along the American River, highlighting the updates recommendations on wise use of floodplains and how these may translate into helping manage further development in floodplains. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan promotes the wise use of floodplains and includes policy recommendations to continue state leadership in the wise use of floodplains, as well as promote floodplain best management guidance. The Central Valley Flood Protection Board regulates floodway encroachments through Title 23 of the California Code of Regulations. We are working with board staff to add a Central Valley Flood Protection Board program wheel graphic, which is similar to the one already included in Chapter 4 for DWR. And this program wheel graphic will reflect major responsibilities of the board, including its role in permitting and enforcement of encroachments, to make sure that's understood in the document. We also received comments highlighting the types of encroachments that occur in the urban parts of South Sacramento, for instance, the big and little pocket areas. Specifically, they commented that fences and other impediments prevent public access to a valuable outdoor recreational resource. We are not recommending specific revisions to the document for these comments, but wanted to highlight it for the board's awareness and consideration. Next slide, please. This is the last slide I have on this, so I'll go through this and we can stop for questions. We received several comments regarding challenges experienced by small communities along the Sacramento River, south of Freeport, down into the Delta area. A couple of the comments focused on the need to prioritize maintenance and repairs along stretches of the Sacramento River adjacent to some of the communities south of Freeport. The department is evaluating some of these potential repairs, and updates to these repairs may be reported as accomplishments in future updates. We also received comments on improving a stretch of levee along the eastern bank of the Sacramento River, just south of Freeport, down to the town of Hood, up to urban standards, mentioning that this levee protects urban areas. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan continues to represent this stretch as non-urban. Increasing the level of protection of an area to urban standards is not the role of the department. Changes to the design level of flood protection and levee accreditation should be initiated and completed at the local and regional levels and require participation by local, state, and federal entities. We also received comments making reference to the Delta legacy communities, with the exception of Isleton, being part of the primary zone of the Delta, which places strict land use constraints on the type of developments that can occur in these areas. The comments mentioned that due to these restrictions, implementation of structural-based flood risk reduction measures will not result in subsequent growth in these communities. We do not recommend any changes be made to the document to address these comments, but we wanted to flag these comments again for the board's awareness and consideration. And so that ends my portion of the presentation on the policy issue comments, and I wanted to open it up for any questions.
I don't see any hands. Before I call on the board, I just want to say there were two interesting chats. One came from Mark Lewis, who said results of past information regarding funding resulted in increase in OMRR funding, especially the creation of FMAP. And then a subsequent comment from Rick Reinhardt that FMAP helped with deferred maintenance. And I've been to other meetings where local entities said FMAP was definitely a game changer in helping to make improvements. So let me ask, board members have any questions, comments here? I have one that these are all extremely valid and extremely important. Some might be more focused toward an implementation strategy, since the plan is not to specify exact actions, but the follow up for that. I know that the board and DW are very interested in this plan not being the end, but the start of the work we need to do or continue to do. So board members.
Through the chair.
Member Grego.
It was mentioned that 2025 is when there's supposed to be a level for urbanized flood protection, for a 200-year. Do you see that happening? Jason?
I am definitely not in that implementation program, so I don't know if I would speak very accurately to that. I'm not sure if Mary or anyone else on the team might be able to provide a little bit more clarity on that. I don't want to speak out of turn, I guess.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's put that and get that to you. There is some effort. Your area, Member Grego, shows it can be done.
Yeah, it can be done. Is it, I guess the question, is it being done?
Yeah, let's make sure that there's specific information for that given to the board. It may not be right now, because there are things that are occurring.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, kudos to you, Beth, for sure. Okay, board members. I don't see any hands. But I want you to know, at least for me, and I'm certain for the other board members and more, we're making notes of things that we might need to address as we are looking to adopt the plan, whether we make changes or whether we put it in a resolution for actions that need to occur. Good discussion. Okay. And somebody waving. People's ceiling fans make me think they're raising their hand. Okay, I think we're ready to go on. Is it you, Mr. Sidley, or do we go to?
I think I will now be passing it over to Ruth Darling to handle the call to action introduction.
Oh, we're already at that, huh, Ruth?
Yeah.
Okay, darling.
Thank you, Jason. Chavez, would you mind going to slide 22? Thank you. Again, I'm Ruth Darling with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and these last two slides are information on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan's call to action. Next slide, please. So the call to action will be a 2-page infographic. It's really directed, the audience would be the state legislature and the Department of Finance. So this is really a supporting document that details our priority actions for the flood plan, and it's our need to communicate the urgent investment for Central Valley flood management. And it'll support priority actions for the $25 to $30 billion need in local, state, and federal investments over the next 30 years. So this is in development collaboratively with the Flood Board and the Department of Water Resources. It's not yet complete, but we're working on it currently. And quite a bit of the stuff that we're considering for the call to action is coming out of these workshops and what we're hearing from our interested parties and partners within the local, state, and federal realm. So I wasn't sure if President Dolan, I know you're an active member in this effort, if you wanted to add anything to the call to action, or perhaps Mary.
I think what you said is very accurate. I guess the management staff and board member level on looking at this draft plan and how the workshops and ultimate adoption goes, it's pretty clear that we need to get the message beyond those of us that are aware of it, and those of it that work within the constraints and the barriers and not being able to do what is clearly a need. So it couldn't be hubris that we think we can call a 2-pager and everybody will say, oh my goodness, we're going to start funding what's necessary. But we're not naive that it will be quick, but we want to immediately make that effort. So this plan and the development and the analysis gets attention, gets implementation, and gets the funding that it's needed. And that's at all levels, federal, state, in any way that we can do it. So we'll be bringing that forward when it's that. Whether that's the tagline for 30 seconds in the elevator is still under discussion.
Thank you. Mary, would you like to add anything?
I raise my hand.
No, not much, Ruth, other than to acknowledge that, yeah, my own department is very interested in this as well, and really looking forward to the collaboration with the board to get this call to action drafted up. And I was very interested to hear what else the board was thinking on this today, so that we can make this as effective as possible when we go to roll it out. So thank you.
Yep, not just board, but others. But it's
Yeah.
Wow, Ms. Darling, how close are we to the end of the slides?
Our next slide is board discussion and public discussion, and then we're through.
Okay, go back to call to action and let me see if there's any specific reactions to that. Just go back one. Thank you. I'm just guessing that people think something like this is necessary. If someone thinks, oh no, everybody knows what we need and will vote for it, then I'd like to hear that.
President Dolan.
Board Member Johnson.
Well, it's absolutely necessary, and you know, at the risk of, you know, being, you know, really stating the obvious, this is a good plan, and there are a couple of really big takeaways from it. We talked a lot today about the price tag and the challenges with getting that investment, being one of them. And so all of us here, but starting with the adoption of the plan, we have to be thinking, not just how do we get a good plan, but how do we sell it, and how do we sell it together? And that absolutely requires us to have an understandable pitch for people who aren't going to have all of the details, to make the case for the funding and to make the case in a way that people can understand and can act on. It's hard to act on $30 billion over 50 years, right? There's not a single decision out there to do that. So we absolutely have to have the case, and we have to have everybody in this room, as much as possible, being unified around what that case is, so that we can take it to all of the different people who have to make all of the subsidiary decisions to get us there. What's needed, what do we get for that? What happens if we do it? What happens if we don't do it? And specifically, what are we asking for? Which decisions can we put in front of different people that they can act on, that will take out big pieces of the bite. And I think honestly, the question isn't whether we can afford it, but we can't afford not to. But us just saying that doesn't work if we're not able to articulate why that's the case to the people who can make the different decisions that we need to put us on the way. And I have more to say about it, but I'll stop there because you asked a simple question and other people should weigh in.
Through the chair.
Yeah.
I just want to add on to Board Member Johnson's comments, because, and I've said it before on the record, that I think flood control infrastructure is the most important of all infrastructure. And the reason why is, if you look at transportation, what good is the roads if they're underwater? I mean, if you don't have flood protection, these other infrastructures are at jeopardy. And like transportation, they have a dependable funding stream, whereas flood control infrastructure fluctuates, whether it's through the bonds or what the legislature dedicates in the budget, whether it's state or federal. It's not, to me, and based on what I've seen so far, that is something that we can depend upon yearly. And so I think that in order to address some of the things that we saw today, as far as O&M and capital improvements, we really need to really look for a dependable funding source that we can depend on to get these projects done over the next 30 years. I mean, it'd be wonderful if it was sooner than 30 years, but 30 years, I guess, is doable in some people's eyes. Thank you.
Any other board members? The last one would be Mr. Countryman. Let me scan here and see if there's any hands up. Any of our participants want to add to this discussion, make a comment? A lot of this is awe-inspiring, I know, and Yes, let me just echo what my board members are saying. We're aware of this, but we need to get it beyond our awareness. And that's a big challenge. Um, we're not saying $30 billion now, but we have seen how other parts of needs and infrastructure do have funding that they know is coming, so you can plan forward. Ours is kind of like whatever we can beg for it at some given time. And the needs just grow. Keeps me up at night. When I see the headlines from Tennessee and Kentucky and other parts of our country, I know it can happen here. And how ready we are is a big question. Okay, so I guess we can go to the slide that says board discussion. Um, our workshops go pretty rapidly, but my take on that is this is not the only time we've ever talked to people and presented this information. So each time we do, it's a refinement. And I really appreciate the work to put into the multiple pages of investment and funding needs into discernible slides today. So thank you for that. Back to the board. Board Member Johnson.
Sure. So my last comment was, one of the key takeaways around the magnitude of the investment and the pace and how we're doing in recent years at capturing that and what needs to be done. One of the other really big takeaways from looking at this plan and including the investments is the latest round of climate change modeling. And I won't go deep into that because we have, next week's workshop where we'll talk about it more. But I'll just say that it's deeply related to the investment decisions and ought to get people's attention, where we're talking about, new modeling that shows, peak flows might rise by as much as 500% under some scenarios. That ought to get people's attention. And we ought to be, all of us, working to make sure that it does as part of the case for these investments and frankly for the case for the sense of urgency and the timeline around the investments and the projects. And I think we will need to ask ourselves, is the investment that we've got in this plan actually enough, given that modeling, right? We heard today, they talked again about the staff who presented this very well. We have a very solid plan. The numbers from, the regional groups and built up. That was all happening in parallel to the modeling and the latest results, which weren't available when these things were designed. And going forward from this plan, we need to be not just making the case for the plan and the investments, but also asking ourselves, is even this level of investment enough, and is it the right mix of investment? And in light of the climate change modeling, I'm not sure that we'll conclude that it is. If you look at figure 321 for folks who have the plan, showing an increase in loss of life over the time of the plan in the Sacramento Valley and potentially in 322 in the San Joaquin Valley, even with these investments, we'll be back very soon as part of the adoption of this to be asking ourselves these hard questions. Is even that magnitude enough? Is it the right mix? Are there other things that we could be doing and need to be doing that have a shorter time horizon than the big investments that would save people's lives? And I think the combination of all of that is not just future tense, but present tense in terms of getting the investments that are on the table funded and making the case for where we need to go now.
I'm glad we're recording this. Very helpful. Thank you. Member Griego, Member Countryman.
Yeah, through the chair.
Absolutely.
It was mentioned about advocacy, about how we change rules or regulations, and that the Department of Water Resources should advocate for changes when there's a barrier. And I think that that's a great idea. I think that has to happen. Things have to change. A lot of these regulations and legislations were written decades ago, and they really aren't applicable to where we are today. But along with that, I think that the Central Valley Flood Control Board and staff need to be a part of that advocacy as well. So I'm just saying that when that advocacy happens, that the board and the staff should also be included in that advocacy. Some of us, and I think probably the majority of us on the board, have experience in those types of advocacies with our state and federal legislatures. So I just don't want for us to be excluded, and because, like I said before, we do have some experience in that. The other thing too is that, you know, I'm on my second time reading this this plan, and there's a real difference between the urbanized areas and the rural areas and how they're, you know, what's being funded. You know, I understand that, you know, not every rural area is going to get the attention that probably they would love to have. But I think that when you look at the system as a whole, the system is only as good as its weakest link. And so if it's those levees are behind, you know, homes, we need to take those in consideration. And then just my last point is this, is that every project is funded a little bit differently. You know, the way Three Rivers was funded is much different than the way the Sacramento projects are funded. And so every project has the ability to get there based on how it's going to be funded. You know, Three Rivers did state and local, whereas more of the Sacramento projects are being funded federally. So I guess that means that there are different ways to do these projects financially. And sometimes, you know, for me, the locals really are the important component of getting these projects done, especially if they have the ability to have an active board, whether it be through the reclamation or through a flood control agency, you know, really giving them some of the strength and empowerment to get these projects done, because they have the most to risk, you know, when high waters come along. So those are the things I'd like to bring up about that.
To your first point, please know the board is involved, is partnering with DWR, and DWR is involved in partnering with the board. Every time we talk about advocacy going forward, implementation, it's not distinct. It is. It's a pair. It's a partner. You and I know that if things at the local area need to get going, we know how to do that. Many local areas do. So it's called fun. You are called fun. Okay, hands up. It's very sobering. Lots to do. All right. There are no more slides. Is that correct, Ms. Darling?
I do have one more slide on the schedule that was showed at the beginning of the presentation, but we're leaving this time open for
Okay,
discussion.
Yes, thank you. Let's not go to that yet. Would any of the DWR folks want to add anything at this point? Okay. Let's go to the next schedule. This is not the last of the workshops or meetings that we will hold. Next slide.
Next slide, please, Travis. Thank you. So just a reminder, we will be discussing comments on our climate change analysis next Friday, August 12th. The workshop will start at 10. It's virtual only. It is the same WebEx link used for today, as well as our regular business board meetings. And we are proposing the board's adoption of the flood plan at the October regular business meeting. And in between the August 12th workshop and the end of October, we'll be editing the document as well as working on the call to action and other components of the plan that will find itself in the draft that comes out in October of 2022. And with that, next slide, please. That's all we have for today.
Could you go back to the schedule, please? One more slide, just a comment from me. There does appear when we see this slide for gaps. These are the meetings of the board that are official to the workshops and to the plan. But in between all these will be coordinating committee and discussions for that, regional flood management, planning entities, hopefully their funding comes through pretty fast, and then the outreach and communication that is so important to DWR and to the board to have those discussions. Flood Control Association, local entities that want to have that, we can do that in between. We have some of the placeholder here that we can't yet announce to see if there needs to be a specific workshop for tribal concerns. We've given outreach to ask for how they want that to be handled. And then, of course, board meetings will have updates on the plan and an opening time for further conversations. So it's not like next Friday is the last, and then see you all in October. There'll be a lot. And I should mention, if the advisory committee wants to meet, we can put that together as well. All right, let's put the thank you. No time for the president to ask for a break.
Did we, President Dolan, I apologize for this. I had some
No,
background noise and
please. Member
muted
Johnson.
myself and stepped away for a second. Just want to make sure that we didn't skip past public discussion. Maybe there just wasn't any. But in the I stepped away for a second in between when we were talking or muted and had my attention directed elsewhere. I may have seen me on camera, but I was not present.
Thank you.
And whether just making sure that we gave everybody who's here who might have had comments on this for discussion an opportunity to do it while we're here.
I think so, but I
Okay.
try to always ask. I've been watching this participants. I keep it open, and I see lots of folks whose names I recognize and some that I don't. So I'm getting to know them, but I haven't seen any hands raised. And also, if someone just wishes to start to talk, they're allowed to do that. Let me ask again. Thank you for doing that. Okay, I just don't see that, but emails can still be done to any of us, and we'll be organizing some outreach to local areas for sure. Last call. Going. All right, we won't have a break. I'll call this meeting to end unless in the next 30 seconds I say wait. I don't see that. Thank you for the presentation. This will be either sent and or posted. People can peruse that. Sobering information. We will all absorb that. We will have further conversations. We've got a while before this all gets finalized. So the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you
Thank you,
next
Jane.
Friday.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.